Hi, and welcome to another episode of I Mustache You Something. And today we have Kofta, who is my first guest who BYO mustache. Uh, I'm very appreciative that he is also willing to look completely ridiculous for the sake of men's health awareness. Um,
This is how you usually look.
yeah, but now I have well, I mean, technically, as of November 1st, I have an excuse, and we're pre-recording these, so technically right now, but like when people are watching this, yada yada yada.
We'll
Uh,
allow it.
yeah, I mean, like sometimes there's an excuse, sometimes there isn't. Either way, this is what's happening. So, Kofta has the best nickname ever, and we uh, recently had a Cannonia Ventures call with someone who was advising us, and she asked, who's in charge of the website, and I said, Kofta, and Mary Ibrahim was like, "Oh my god, I can't believe it." She really thought like I'd pull out like some kind of professionalism out of like the real like bottom of the barrel and like maybe say your real name, and I was like, no, it's Kofta. So welcome, and I think much like Jesse Newman, who was my good friend from middle school and high school, who chose not to be prepped at all, and we just kind of started. I chose in this case not to prep Kofta at all. Um, so one of the reasons for that is I I genuinely don't know what to talk to you about, and I genuinely don't know where this is going to go. I think with most other people, I kind of have a sense of, what they're going to contribute and what their thoughts will be. You are unlike me, who my wife Mary calls me predictably unpredictable. You are unpredictably unpredictable. Special.
Pretty high praise.
Yeah. So, well,
Depending on who
depends
you
on
ask.
your perspective.
I took it as a compliment.
Yes, I take lots of insults directed at me also as compliments. So that is a great coping strategy. That's awesome.
For sure.
Um, so what do you want to talk about?
That's a tough question and one that I'm probably not going to be able to answer. Like I said in the last email, I'm seldom compelled to talk, much less come up with a topic of conversation. So
But you always have a question, like whether you verbalize the question, right,
I
or
always,
whether you
I,
keep it to yourself. Your brain is always going, and you're always like, what's happening here?
I suppose, yeah. But usually there's an ongoing conversation to begin with, and I'm a bystander to that conversation. Then I butt in with whatever questions I have.
And
We
even
can
if,
talk.
and even if you don't butt in, like in your head, I know what's happening. Like I look at you sometimes, and you look at me, and we're like, yeah, we're thinking the same thing.
I suppose that's true.
So
Uh,
so I guess a lot of the times, like when I'm doing this mustache thing with people, um, one thing that comes up is what censorship should we have on questions, and do we believe in censoring questions, or are there questions that should be left unasked and unexplored?
Only if we're afraid of the answers, I suppose.
So what does that mean? What is it? So elaborate, please.
Um, well, I mean, okay. So not all questions have answers, right? But there are many that do, and even those that don't have a concrete answer are answered by saying that there's no answer and here's why. But if we, and so like, given that premise, there's no reason to not ask a question or not to entertain a question unless we know that there's an answer that we just don't want to disseminate or give. Otherwise, why fear a question, right?
So I understand that that makes logical sense, but does everything make logical sense?
Unfortunately, not. I suppose.
Okay, so if we step outside of this, I'm a Google programmer world and everything makes sense in these four walls, and we step into reality, what are some other explanations why something may potentially be a question that some people would say, no, no question, no, we're not entertaining that?
Perhaps for fear that entertaining the question will set you down a dark path. I don't know. There are all these considerations when you consider mental health, etc., and the limitations of a human being and the human mind. I suppose that attempting to entertain all questions isn't healthy, but I don't think you can fault the question itself. I don't.
So is there merit in that position that some questions, you know, are just going to ruin you in some way, but just in the seeking of their answers or in the asking of the question?
I suppose depending on your intent or your intent as you approach the question. If if you're looking for an answer as you ask the question, then more likely than not, it doesn't bode well for you. But again, that's not the fault of the question. That's the fault of the question, the asker of the question. I don't know what the proper term for a person in that position is.
So you bring in intent, right? I want you to give me an example of a question that if you ask it with good intent is fine and bad intent is not fine.
Is there a God?
Okay.
Is there a greater power, an
Okay.
almighty being that I can't see?
Okay.
There.
So clarify for me, how is that question asked in with good intent and how is that question asked with not so good?
Well, more often than not, when people ask the question, they're asking it with an answer in mind, and the answer is no, there isn't, and I need you. Like, the onus is on whoever's being asked to provide proof for the argument that yes, there is, and here's why. And if your proof or your argument isn't sufficient to convince me that there there is a God, which it most likely won't be because I've already decided, then asking the question in the first place, it just opens the door for, I don't know, for you to spiral into unhealthy, and as opposed to if I were to ask the question, maybe not necessarily like having even made up my mind, but open to either conclusion and open to the arguments that are to be made. I think that that's healthy, even if the conclusion that I end with is that no, there is no God. I think that that's okay, as long as the way that the question is asked isn't leading.
Do you know how many panic attacks you just induced?
Yeah, well,
like I've recorded several of these already, and there's been a couple where I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely getting in trouble for this. I'm like, I don't know if this person knows that they just got both of us into a heap of trouble, but I'm definitely going to hear about this. Um, so I I wanna follow up to that statement that you just made, where if someone's genuinely asking, they're genuinely concerned. and they're open, right? And they're not like, prove to me and like, find me a feather from the Archangel Gabriel, or no, someone's genuinely asking, right?
Right.
And they're willing to be convinced. And in medicine we call that the pretest possibility, right? Like if the pretest possibility is reasonable enough that investigating further makes sense, then fine, right? If the pretest probability is already like nearly 100%, then like we're not really asking questions, right? Like we get a test that shows a negative result, we're still like like we're still pretty convinced this is the case, right?
Mhm.
And if some pretest possibility is so low that like even if a positive test came back, you'd still be like, no, I still don't think that this is real. Then you still don't do the test, right? So it matters like what someone's starting with. So I completely agree with that. But I think the thing that just made all Sunday school servants and church leaders and hopefully none of them are listening to this to call me and be like, hey, like the bow was el auled, and like ruin whatever semblance of a role I have in the church as it stands. But what you're saying is, and what is going to make for great problems for me, is that it's okay to ask this question if you're genuinely asking, and it's okay not to be convinced.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
If
So
it's not okay not to be convinced, then it's not okay to ask the question. Then
and what
it's
else is not okay? And what
it's
so keep following that train of logic, right? Because if it's not okay not to be convinced, then it's not okay to not ask the question. What else does that imply?
I mean, from where I'm standing, that means it's not okay to really even believe it. That you can't if you don't ask the question, if you're not really convinced. Or I guess no, I'm on the flip side here. Let's backtrack. You're saying if it's not okay,
If someone tells you that you're
right?
allowed to ask as long as you believe after after I give you your answer, like you're gonna have to say yes, right? And you're saying like it's okay to ask as long as you're asking with an open and inquiring and inquisitive heart, um, even if the answer is no, right? And what you
Right.
said was, because if the answer is no and I'm not allowed to say that, then you're implying that the question wasn't even worth asking in the first place, right?
Exactly.
But there's more there. Like unpack that a little bit more. And why is it problematic to only allow that question to be asked if the answer is yes?
Okay. Let me go out on a limb here. This is kind of my train of thought. Is a question, it should be binary, or not binary, but at least there should be more than one option. It's or one answer. There's no one potential answer. Otherwise, there's no point of asking the question. If there's no point of asking the question because there's already like there's a single truth and no possibility, then you are unwillingly subject to that answer and that possibility. So henceforth, you've never actually subscribed to that answer or that truth, because I think the only way you're able to actually subscribe to anything is to have options, to ask a question, and then to choose one.
And what happens if there is no option?
There is no free will.
Thank you. So if we're talking about, instead of the existence of God, we'll put that aside for now. 2 plus 2 is
Beats me.
2 plus 2 is 4.
Uh,
You've done so much math and you've done so much programming, like it's already knocked out some of the earlier stuff out.
I haven't added two numbers together in ages.
Really?
No, it's a joke, but
So if 2 plus 2 is 4, right? And someone comes in and asks, listen, I was just wondering, right? Is it possible that 2 plus 2 is 7, right? The response might be, I mean, you can ask, but like there's only one reality here, right? It's something that falls in the realm of discrete logic and rationality, and like it just simply has an answer, right? It's not an unanswerable thing, it's an answerable thing, right? Something that falls outside of answerable things are going to be matters of what?
Mystery.
Mystery, faith, spirituality, right? Something that falls outside of what we are going to be able to have a handle on, right?
Sure.
So God, the existence of God, the nature of God, the relationship that we have with God, is that a matter of faith, or is that a matter of 2 plus 2 and like just very straightforward?
Faith.
Okay. So now what I'm getting at is what you're saying sounds heretical, right? It sounds like, no, you can't say that, right?
And it could be.
What's that?
It could be.
But if you look at it, that the existence of God and the self-revelation of God and what we know about God, because God revealed God's self to us, and God said, here's who I am, and I'd like a relationship with you, right? Requires, and if you go all the way back to Job and Abraham and Moses and all the way up to Paul, and the saints and like present time people that believe in God and everyone in between, right? Would it be fair for any of those people to demand and ask God, like, prove yourself to me?
No.
So what would that look like if someone did?
But would it just so I'm clear here, would it be unfair for any of them to look up and ask God, are you there?
Sure. But again, there's a difference between, are you there? I may or may not like the answer that I get.
Yes.
Right? He might just go, and we're sitting here going, are you serious right now? You're going to lean back in your chair? What are you doing? Right? And it might be that we don't like the answer to that question, right? But if it enters into the realm of proof, right, and it enters into the realm of discrete knowledge, right, and it enters into the realm of something that, I mean, it's just unassailable, like 2 plus 2 is 4, 9 plus 6 is probably 15 or something like that, right? So like if the existence of God and how we relate to God becomes something that's that straightforward, is it still a matter of faith?
No, but I'm not advocating for it to be that straightforward, because we don't ask questions like, is 2 plus 2 4? Right? We those aren't, nobody's going around asking questions like that. We're asking questions where there are possibilities, and whether we like to admit it or not, that this is one where there is a possibility. And the question, I think, is justified so long as we haven't answered it. And my computer just went to sleep.
I think most of the people listening to this also went to sleep, so it's fine.
Yeah,
your computer's in very good company.
Yeah, and I don't think that I wouldn't call a request for proof. I wouldn't define a question, or I wouldn't define a request for proof as a question. I don't think they're synonymous. I don't like for example, and you make this argument way better than I do, but very often you bring up the null hypothesis, right? And the way the null hypothesis works is you have, and you can probably reiterate this much better than I can, but generally speaking, you have a hypothesis and you're trying to disprove it. You're not requesting proof, and that's the only way that anything is ever published, etc. Like, you spend weeks, months, years, lifetimes trying to disprove a hypothesis. And in the same sense, here you can be asking a question, right? Maybe, does God exist, or does he not exist? And then I guess what I'm trying to say is the lack of immediate proof, or the need for immediate proof, that's not a question. That's something completely different. What a question is asking something, having a hypothesis, and then welcoming, maybe even eternally welcoming, disproving evidence or points, or proving evidence or points, or evidence, like any kind of evidence, but always welcoming it and allowing it to change your perception or your hypothesis, or etc. That makes sense.
Right. And if you're going to treat the existence of God scientifically, and your null hypothesis, right, is framed as God exists, right, and you're trying to disprove that null hypothesis, right?
Right.
You have to design an experiment that proves that God doesn't exist.
And my life is an experiment, is it not?
Okay. Sure, of course. And I think that if the answer were answerable, right, and the data was collectible in our lifetime, then your experiment, that your life is the experiment, would hold water, right? But
right.
The data point doesn't come in until it's all said and done, right?
I mean, in a rigorous sense.
In a rigorous sense, yes.
In a rigorous sense, but in a less rigorous sense, I suppose the data is collectible. I mean, as far as you can collect your thoughts and memory, you can collect whatever data points there are throughout your life to make the case for the existence or not of God.
So are any of those data points and experiences unassailable, where you can say, okay, because Kofta interpreted this way?
Well, no, but no lone data point, whether we're talking rigorously or not rigorously, is unassailable, right? Every lone individual data point is assailable, and that doesn't change that in aggregate the data points are meaningful.
Okay, so let's explore this, because I think this is interesting, because we have conflated two things, which I have no problem doing. One being an experiment, which should have clear data points, and two, experience, which many would argue is like always going to be fraught with bias and perspective, and pre-test assumptions, and like all sorts of things that, like, no matter what you try to say, at the end of the day, like a true scientist and like somebody that's really rigorous is going to go, that's just your interpretation. No.
Okay, but that's also, there's a little bit of bias therein as well, right?
Like,
in an experiment, like, you try to control for every variable you can imagine, but still there are thousands that you can't control for and don't know that you need to control for, perhaps. And so in that sense, in a kind of, I guess a little bit more theoretical and for the sake of the argument kind of sense, you could argue perhaps that even in the most rigorous scientific experiments, an individual data point always has to be assailable.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's still, and that's why I'm saying, yeah, I understand, all of the nuances to this and how problematic it could be from both a rational, scientific, spiritual standpoint. But fine, let's go along with this thought experiment that our life, right? Our life
Or
is,
like,
is the experiment.
right.
But we also have to say that if the experiment's going to be properly designed, then you have to leave room and you have to be collecting data that isn't just I did this study to prove this thing, right?
Right.
Because if you already have the answer before you start collecting the data, it's not really an experiment. It's just kind of like a proof study that doesn't make any sense, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So what is the data then? Like, what data are we collecting and what are we asking in terms of like our day-to-day experience that would lend itself to potentially answering this question?
That, my friend, is an excellent question in and of itself.
It was your idea. It's not my idea. You're like, my life is an experiment.
I propose this question as an example, the type of question that we oftentimes feel shouldn't be asked. But I guess in any case,
we'll get back to that in a minute.
Right. I suppose interpersonal relationships, depending on how you contextualize them, could be a data point for the existence of God, or any happenings or occurrences that you perceive as supernatural or God sent or non-coincidental or statistically improbable. And again, depending on how you contextualize them, happenings that are traumatic, that are violent, that are evil, that are discouraging, you could, and whether or not this is right or wrong is obviously up for debate, but you could use those as data points for there is no God, I suppose, or I might perhaps. Yeah, I mean, and then the list goes on. These are a few examples.
So I'll tell you that there are two extreme and opposing objections to that experiment.
Mm.
One extreme objection to doing that is, this is a waste of time. God doesn't exist. What's the point of even asking the question?
Right.
The other one is, how dare you question God, right? Like, if you question God, like we're already missing the point, right? So how do you justify yourself to the second group, the group that says like if you're getting to this point where you're interrogating God, then you're not going to get any.
But I'm not interrogating God, and both of.
What are you interrogating?
In a way, myself. In a way, the evidence, because it's not like the evidence is there, I suppose. Like, there's a whole world around me, right? Most of which I haven't yet been exposed to, and probably will never be exposed to, and all of it could be considered evidence in one way or another. for the existence or absence of God, and I'm interpreting it. I'm struggling with it, as well as myself, of course.
Do you have any examples of saints in the Coptic Church that interrogated their experience and interrogated the world around them, and were searching for God, like genuinely? Because again, like we've already identified that the way the question is asked and the intent of the asking of the question matters, right? Like
Right.
asking just to argue, like that's a waste of everybody's time, right? Asking like just as a matter of interest, again, not really that. Asking with true concern and desire to be motivated in one direction or another is reasonable, right? And you're saying, fine, our life is the experiment. Our life experience is what's going to nudge us in one direction or another.
Right.
Again, are there any saints that did that?
Only one comes to mind, but I'll admit that I'm a little bit rusty on my saints.
I'll be honest, like only one comes to my mind also, and I'm hoping you have the same one.
I was going to say St. Moses the Black.
Yeah, okay. That's the one. Right. Okay, so tell us. How?
Ooh, no, if you want me to recount the story.
Very basically, right? Like he was looking for an answer to the question, and he said to the son, like, hey, if you're God, reveal yourself, right? So what we see from that, he's open to an answer, right? He hasn't answered the question already. He's bold enough, even though he's on what someone who believes in God would consider to be on the wrong side of the question, right? Because if you look at his life, there's really no evidence that he's following any of these things. So did he? No, but he's willing to be convinced otherwise, right? So his pre-test possibility, does God exist, is like 30, 40%. It's not zero, but it's definitely not favorable, right? But he's willing, right? He's willing to ask questions. He's willing to be convinced, right? So what does that tell us about our experience? What matters in our experience if we're going to follow your advice to do an experiment?
That you be willing to be convinced.
And?
I'm probably not going to say what you want me to say. So,
like, is that it? Is that it? Like, is that both necessary and sufficient? To just be willing to be convinced? Like, I'm just gonna, okay, God, how about it? Is that enough?
Oh, I see what you're getting at. You have to be, what's the word? Less passive about the way you ask the questions. Intentional, you're resolute in the way that you go about the question. You ask the question, you seek the answer, instead of you ask the question and you wait for the answer.
Right? So
important distinction.
I think it's an important distinction because, anyone who's published a paper knows the data doesn't collect itself.
Right.
Like, I wish it did. Right? You're publishing papers left and right. But because the data doesn't collect itself, there's an inertia, there's a momentum that one needs to build in order to be able to say, I'm collecting enough data points in order to even remotely wonder if this question is even worth asking.
Right.
So what does that look like?
Not me. What does that look like? I don't know. It's a great question. I suppose, a healthy dose of reflection and introspection consistently spread out throughout the day or the week or the month or the lifetime. Honestly, one thing I've found myself struggling with is having not willfully collected data points, but just vaguely remembering having experienced them. I'm stuck in a state of I remember that these data points were there and existed at one point, but being rigorous at the moment and not having any data points, I tend to dismiss them. And had I perhaps documented them, or maybe even reflected on them so intensely or more intensely, such that they became more foundational or contributed more foundationally to my faith or the state of my faith, then maybe I'd be better off than I am now.
Is it too late to collect data points?
It is not too late to collect data points. I'm not saying it's too late at all. I'm just saying that I like you've said that you experience as well, and maybe few others experience. I tend to ebb and flow in my spiritual life,
Okay.
and this being a flow, whichever one the trough is in the ebb and flow analogy. This being a trough, I maybe naturally find myself reminiscing about the peak and wondering, like, where are the data points? I wish I had documented or recorded the data points so that I could convince myself now, in this dearth of data points, that here they are. I collected them at some point, and though I've gone, like, I don't know, some stretch of time without happening upon another one, that doesn't mean that they were never there.
And if we go back to our initial question, which is, like, is this a question worth asking, right? The existence of God, right? And again, like, I'm sure, like, there are many people who stopped listening right when you said, and sometimes the answer is no, and it's like, oh, no, I thought these were Christians, right? And there's this, like, you can, like, I can't imagine a world where the answer could possibly be no. How could you say that, right? But I think what you're saying is that the problem isn't so much that you asked that question too much, is that you didn't ask it enough.
Yes, or that I forgot that I was asking it.
Or that you forgot you were asking it, and that you got an answer that was like a pretty yes-ish sounding kind of thing.
Right, but I forgot the question, and so I didn't interpret the answer in the right context.
Right. And sometimes, like, and I've said this before, I've, like, stumbled upon the answer, like, not really expecting it, and, like, the yes answer just hits you right in the face, and you're like, okay, like, I mean, I'd love to deny that experience. Like, my life would be a lot easier if I could just do whatever I want. But now I feel, this sort of responsibility to this answer, right? This answer comes with consequences. This answer comes with the costly grace of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Like the need to say, I believe, and therefore I must act, right? Is something that is sometimes thrust upon us, and sometimes it makes no sense to anyone else. Like, you tell them, like, oh, like da, 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 and they're like, okay, like that's like totally not reasonable at all. Like, okay, fine. Like it was it's not your, it's my experience. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to you. But these experiences are the accidental answering of that existing question.
Yes.
Right? Whether we're deliberately seeking them or not, sometimes they find us, right? And sometimes we're seeking an answer, and like this is where I'm really gonna get myself in trouble. Is not only did I have this guest who said that sometimes the answer is no, I have the audacity to agree that sometimes, not in the reality, not in the metaphysics of it, not in the existential nature of it, but in my personal interpretation of it, I feel like the answer is no. And we're in good company with David the prophet, who's like all over the map with his feelings. Right?
Right.
So I don't know. I don't know how to answer the question any better than anyone else. But I do think that you make a very strong argument for the asking of the question being important. So if we're agreeing that asking the question, right, is an important thing,
yes, sir.
How do we recognize when we've stopped asking in a deliberate fashion, right? Because if we're considering it to be an experiment, right, and you work in a lab, and you haven't shown up to lab in 6 months, like you're probably not collecting data, right? I think this is a more complicated question. It's a more nuanced question, right? How do you know if you're truly asking the question? How do you know if you're struggling with the question? How do you know if you're collecting data, and vice versa? How do you know, how can you set like kind of an alarm that says, hey, you kind of stopped asking this question X number of months, years ago?
Well, for kind of a lack of a better answer, I feel like we tend to, or most tend to be able to discern whether or not they're doing something deliberately or passively or willfully or unwillfully. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like if you have to go out of your way, at least when and this is a reference to that little pundit square that you present all the time. I'm blanking on the name, but or conscious competence, I suppose. If you're asking or usually or trying to contextualize experiences or events from the lens of like, does God exist, or is this an act of God, or His grace, or something of that nature? I feel like you know if you're doing it or you're not, right? And if you're taking all of your experiences in stride and not attributing or not even attempting to attribute any of them to God, or not necessarily even attributing, but contextualizing them in the realm of, or in terms of the question, right? Does God exist? Is there a higher power, like, etc.? Then obviously, I mean, you're not going about it deliberately, and I don't know that there's more nuance to it than you're either doing it or you're not, and you know if you're doing it or you're not.
So do you remember when we talked about Sister Ruth Burroughs, and the essence of prayer? She's
Yes.
the one that says, the reason that you don't pray is because you don't want to.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And like you're reminding me of her, like where it's just like, listen, like we can like and like do a shell game of effort versus non-effort. At the end of the day, like it's really not that.
Yeah.
It's
And
not
I
that.
love nuance things. I love nuance. Nuance is how like I get out of almost any like situation where like I've said something wrong or feel like I guess the wrong way or have an unpopular opinion. I love to nuance my way out of this and that, but I don't think that this is like a particularly a question where nuance is appropriate. I mean we could nuance the hell out of it for lack of a better word, but I feel like
Literally. So the the other thing that Sister Ruth Burrows says is it doesn't really matter how you pray, right? There's lots of different ways to pray, right? And she says the method is not the prayer, right? I pray with this and I pray with that and I do this and I do that. It's like, okay, like you do all these things, but is there like an actual engagement and an actual relationship with God behind these things?
Mhm.
And if there isn't, right, if it's like, oh, it's all about me and doing these things, then she would argue, man, you're like, yeah, you're doing these things, you're going through the motions, but like, you know, the title of her book is The Essence of Prayer. Like the essence of prayer is missing, right? So I think for your purposes, like when you're saying that the question is being asked or not, right? You're either interrogating your experience or not. You're seeking God or not, right? You know, it's something that is not so far from our hearts, right? We know when we're kind of like, I'll ask tomorrow. You know, I've asked before, I didn't get an answer, or I didn't like the answer I got, which is sometimes, right? Like sometimes we get the yes answer, and it's like, no, I don't like that answer, right? Too much responsibility with that answer. Like, let me just pretend again this nuance, you know,
Mhm.
hand waving thing. So if the method doesn't really matter, right? The method by which we seek God also doesn't matter. And I think there's a kind of a connection there between, you know, prayer being our engagement with God and the Kofta experiment being the seeking of God, um, being intertwined in some way.
Sure.
So now I must ask you something.
Yes, sir.
Do we have a responsibility to each other to remind each other to ask this question?
See, that's tricky because not everyone perceives questions in this way, right? In I guess my ideal world. I was going to say in an ideal world, but this isn't everyone's ideal. This is my ideal. In an ideal world where everyone thinks like me and um, and values questions in the same way that I do, or that we do, or that a lot of people do, I suppose. Um, then yes, because I don't see that any harm can come of it. If you're going about your day and I remind you of this question and and uh, and you're not off put by it and you use it to contextualize and interrogate your experience, then bravo, right? But if I, let's say, ask the question to someone that doesn't have the same relationship with questions, then uh,
Then
you
how
know,
could we take it negatively then? Like what are the opportunities for failure there?
well, I mean, a number of things that we've discussed. For example, they could hear the question and answer it, and depending on what the answer is, and regardless of what the answer is, I think that's a negative. It's a net negative. I mean, they're better off not asking the question at all than asking the question and answering it immediately, right? So
It's not
I,
really a question, right? It's not really a question. Like it's not an experience, right? It's not a, it's not a worthwhile exercise if, the exercise, the end result of the exercise is already determined.
Exactly.
Right. Right. But if at least that this is someone that you love, that you care about, that does ask questions and does seek, or at least has seeked in the past, sought,
So
has sought.
yeah.
Again, the question is, and you're right, perhaps like timing is bad, method is bad, mustache is bad, like there's lots of like different things that could go wrong, and like, nobody knows more than me how like challenging interpersonal relationships are. It's, I didn't I didn't know, like I didn't mean, but it wasn't meant to, like, okay, I'm just sorry, only
Right.
so for sure it could go awry any one of a number of different ways. But again, the question still remains, does one individual have a responsibility for another individual's ongoing experiment in some way? Not wholly responsible, obviously, but like, do we participate in each other's experiment, I guess, is another way of asking the same question.
We do. I think I'm hesitant to call it a responsibility because um, although if you hold yourself responsible for it, then by all means, but holding other people responsible for the contextualization of the experiences of others outside of themselves, I think is tricky. But yes, they do participate. I think I believe that. And I don't have any reservations in saying that. Of course, like you and me are in the same room and we experience something together. Say the way that I interpret it or interrogate it or contextualize it or don't do any of those things will definitely impact the way you do in some sense or another. Um, um, yeah, and the way you interpret it will definitely, and some, especially if you focalize that interpretation, will definitely help me interpret it, and maybe and definitely subconsciously, like I like to fancy myself an independent person with independent thoughts, etc. But at the end of the day, if I love and respect you and we're in the same room and something happens, let's say we're teaching Sunday school, and he who shall not be named does something, and you react in the way that I would usually react, in a very nihilistic, none of this matters, this is hopeless kind of way. Uh, I will definitely unknowingly and subconsciously be sensitive to that, and as a result, will probably um, view the situation more negatively or contextualize it more negatively than I would otherwise. And so, as a result, I think that the reverse is definitely true. That if you were to spin it positively, and contextualize it in the question, in terms of whatever question it is we're asking, then I'm more prone to do the same. Or at least you've planted a seed for that specific experience, for whatever I'm thinking at that moment, that like, there's this perspective, there's this lens that I can view this experience through.
So in the interest of wrapping up here, what we've discussed is, number one, we have questions. Number two, some of those questions have very clear answers that are a matter of, discrete knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those have a indeterminate answer, and we say those things are matters of faith, and that matters of faith are things that we interrogate through our experience, and things that we are hopefully being deliberate about, and how we understand them. How do we know God? How do we love each other? How Do we live in a community where, there's different points of view, right? And that if we have forgotten that we have these questions, we need to remind ourselves. And, that I mean, neither one of us has a really good answer as to, when you realize like, oh, like I completely forgot about this question, or, I haven't asked it in a while, or, I've just ignored the answers because I just don't like the answers, right? But the hope is that we can encourage ourselves and each other to ask these questions, and the way that we see other people answer the questions, right, and their experience influences both our capacity to ask the questions and answer them in some way that is intelligible. Right? Is that a fair summary?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any parting thoughts for any listeners that haven't already thrown their phone/computer, burned it in effigy, and called my priest and said, this guy needs to go? So anybody that needs to still be around, like, do you have anything else to say to them?
You're posting this on YouTube, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, so this is going to be a worldwide excommunication of yours truly.
I'd like to encourage whoever's left at this point to go in the comments section and vote on the better mustache, and maybe this can be a trend that you keep up with other guys.
Now we're gonna lose each other. After all these years, you found.
Let the people decide. I'm not saying anything. I personally, like, if I were to throw my vote into the ring, would of course vote for yours. But let's let the people.
That's very gracious of you. And I was actually just thinking about it. I'm like, you pointed this out to me earlier, and I've been like obsessing about it. Like, this is definitely not as coiffed as this side. Like, this is like and this side's kind of like so. Like, it's been killing me like this whole time. And you pointed out to me, and I tried to fix it, and I didn't fix it very well. And I think I've just got like a little too much here. And yours has that like, exuberant freshness of a new mustache.
Actually, 2 of the 5 minutes I was gone was me trying to spin, but decided that I didn't have enough hair to do it, so I just put it back down.
No, it looks spectacular. It looks spectacular. I think you should keep it. I think the world would be better for it.
You think so? I think every other person in my life would disagree.
Do the experiment.
Yeah, like, perhaps.
How will you know without at least interrogating your experience in the month of November, right? And you need enough data points. You need the whole month, right? Exactly. You can't be like, 3 days. Like, you need the whole month, right? People insulting you, telling you look terrible, the way that they've told me since April. Like, yes, like, you need more data points. Like, I have plenty of data points to tell me, like, this is horrific. But you need more. You definitely need more.
It sounds like you've forgotten that you're asking the question.
Yeah, I never really even asked it. Like, it's kind of like a fake question. I'm like, oh, what do you think of my mustache? Like, I don't know. Always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks for coming. And for those of you that are left, thank you for listening.